All right, ready to dive deep. Today, we're going to tackle the framing effect.
Yeah.
Ever notice how, like, the same info can sound totally different just
Mhm.
based on how it's presented? That's framing, and it's way more powerful than you might think.
Yeah, for sure.
We've got some fascinating research here, from classic psychological studies to real-world examples that'll
It'll make you question everything.
make you question, yeah, everything you thought you knew about making choices.
It's really interesting. What's so intriguing about the framing effect is that it reveals that we aren't always the rational decision makers we think we are.
Right.
Our choices, it turns out, are swayed by these subtle cues,
Oh, yeah.
even when the facts are the same.
So basically, our brains are playing tricks on us,
Yeah.
making us think we're being logical, when
Yeah.
really we're falling for these framing traps, left and right. I'm kind of scared to find out how often this happens to me.
Right.
To kick things off, can you give us a clear definition of what exactly the framing effect is?
Absolutely. The framing effect describes how the presentation of information, the specific words used, or the emphasis placed can influence the choices people make, even when the options are objectively the same.
Uh-huh.
It's like looking at the same painting from different angles. The painting itself doesn't change,
Right.
but your perception of it does.
Okay. I'm starting to see the picture here,
Good.
but I need a real-world example to really grasp this. You know how I learn best.
Sure. One of the most famous examples comes from a study on how people respond to a hypothetical scenario. It involves an unusual Asian disease.
Okay.
So imagine you're faced with two options for combating this disease, both with identical statistical outcomes.
Okay. I'm picturing myself in this high-pressure situation. What are my options?
All right, so in the first frame, the options are presented in terms of lives saved.
Okay.
Program A guarantees that 200 out of 600 people will be saved.
Got it.
Program B has a 1/3 chance of saving all 600 people, but a 2/3 chance of saving no one.
So with Program A, at least some lives are definitely saved.
Right.
It feels safer, even though Program B has the potential to save everyone.
Now consider the second frame, where the same options are presented in terms of lives lost.
Okay.
Program C will lead to the death of 400 people, while Program D has a 1/3 chance that no one will die and a 2/3 chance that all 600 will die.
It's the same problem, just worded differently.
Yes.
But I have a feeling people react very differently to these two scenarios, don't they?
Exactly. Studies have shown that when framed in terms of lives saved, people tend to choose the certain option, Program A, the safe choice. But when the same options are framed in terms of lives lost, people are more likely to go for the risky option, Program D.
Wow, that's incredible. Just changing the wording completely flips people's risk tolerance,
Hmm.
even though the statistical outcome is the same.
Right.
What's the takeaway here?
Well, this Asian disease problem highlights how framing can exploit our aversion to loss. We're naturally more motivated to avoid a sure loss than we are to pursue an uncertain gain,
Okay.
which means even subtle changes in wording can dramatically shift our perception of risk and ultimately our choices.
So it's not just about logic. Our emotions are pulling the strings behind the scenes,
Yeah.
especially when faced with potential losses. This is already making me rethink how I approach everyday decisions. But let's break this down even further. What are the different types of framing effects we should be on the lookout for?
You're right. The framing effect isn't just one monolithic phenomenon. There are several ways framing can influence our choices.
Uh-huh.
Let's explore three of the most common forms:
Okay.
risky framing, attribute framing, and target framing.
Okay, let's start with risky framing. What's the lowdown on that one?
Risky framing centers on how we perceive risk and certainty. It plays on our tendency to favor certain gains over potentially larger but uncertain gains, even if the expected value is the same.
Yeah.
For example, think about being offered a guaranteed $50 versus a 50% chance of winning $100.
Most people would take the guaranteed $50, right?
Yeah,
Even though there's a chance they could double their money with the other option.
precisely. And risky framing also influences how we handle potential losses.
Okay.
We're more likely to take risks to avoid a certain loss,
Mm-hmm.
even if it means potentially losing even more.
So it's like we're wired to play it safe with potential gains, but get a little reckless when trying to dodge a loss.
Yeah.
I can see how this could play out in everything from investing to even everyday choices, like choosing between restaurants.
Hmm.
What about attribute framing? How does that work?
Attribute framing focuses on presenting the same attribute in either a positive or negative light.
Okay.
It's all about highlighting different aspects of the same information to sway our perception.
Okay, I think I get it.
Good.
Like the classic example of describing ground beef is either 80% lean or 20% fat. Same product, different emphasis.
Exactly. Even though both descriptions refer to the same thing, 80% lean sounds way more appealing and healthier than 20% fat. Attribute framing is incredibly effective because it taps into our emotional responses. Positive framing triggers feelings of attraction and desire, while negative framing evokes aversion and fear.
That makes perfect sense. Advertisers must have a field day with attribute framing. And it's not just about food, right? I bet it applies to all sorts of products and services.
Absolutely. Think about how a car salesperson might highlight the safety features of a vehicle to appeal to a family-oriented buyer, while emphasizing its speed and performance to a younger, thrill-seeking customer.
Oh, yeah.
It's the same car, but the framing changes everything.
It's like they're painting different mental pictures for each buyer, highlighting the aspects that resonate most with their desires and values. And that brings us to our final type of framing, target framing.
Mhm.
What's the story there?
Target framing zeroes in on either the positive consequences of taking action or the negative consequences of inaction. It's about creating a sense of urgency or highlighting potential losses to nudge us in a specific direction.
I'm starting to see the pattern here.
Hmm.
It's all about playing on our emotions, whether it's our desire for gain fear of loss, or even just that nagging feeling of, what if I miss out?
Precisely. A classic example of target framing is a marketing campaign that emphasizes the savings you'll miss out on if you don't take advantage of a limited time offer. Or think about those public service announcements that warn about the health risks of smoking by highlighting the potential consequences of inaction, like developing lung cancer.
Those are such powerful examples. It's like they're saying, don't just stand there, do something. Or in the case of smoking, if you don't stop, now this is what could happen.
Yeah.
It really drives the message home.
It's a clever tactic, and it's used everywhere from advertising and marketing to public health campaigns and political messaging.
This is all mind-blowing stuff. But let's shift gears for a moment and talk about how this actually plays out in real-world research.
Hmm.
We've got a stack of studies here that explore the framing effect in different contexts. Where should we start?
Let's begin with a study that examined how framing effects influence online shopping behavior.
Okay.
Researchers manipulated the way price information was presented to consumers and measured the impact on their purchase intentions.
So like showing the same price but using different wording or layouts.
Exactly. That found that subtle changes in price framing could significantly impact consumer choices. For example, presenting a discount as a gain, like save $10, was more effective than presenting it as a loss, like you lose $10 if you don't buy now.
That's fascinating.
Mm.
It seems like our brains are wired to respond more strongly to potential gains, even if the underlying value is the same. It's like we're more motivated by the idea of getting something extra than we are by avoiding a potential loss.
That's a key insight. And it has huge implications for marketers and anyone trying to influence consumer behavior.
Yeah.
By framing their messages in terms of potential gains, they can tap into this psychological bias and make their offers more appealing.
This is making me rethink my entire online shopping strategy. But let's move beyond the digital world for a moment. What about the impact of framing effects in a, shall we say, more high-stakes domain? I'm thinking about the study we have here on media coverage of the Iraq War.
Ah, yes. That study examines how the way media framed the war influenced public opinion. Specifically, it focused on the use of what researchers called mythical versus non-mythical framing.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Break those down for me. What exactly does mythical framing mean in this context?
In this study, mythical framing refers to a presentation that simplifies complex realities, often portraying events in a black and white, good versus evil manner. It tends to rely on strong imagery, emotional appeals, and clear-cut heroes and villains.
So less nuanced and more about appealing to gut reactions.
Exactly. Mythical framing aims to evoke a strong emotional response, often tapping into existing cultural narratives or archetypes. It can be a powerful tool for rallying support or demonizing opponents, but it often sacrifices nuance and complexity in the process.
So mythical framing is about telling a compelling story, even if it doesn't capture the full picture. What about non-mythical framing? How is that different?
Non-mythical framing attempts to present a more balanced and factual account of events, acknowledging complexity and avoiding overly simplistic narratives. It focuses on providing context, presenting different perspectives, and letting the audience draw their own conclusions.
So it's less about tugging at heartstrings and more about appealing to our rational minds.
Precisely, non-mythical framing recognizes that most issues are complex and multifaceted, and it aims to present a more complete picture, even if it's less emotionally compelling.
This is making me think about all the different ways we encounter these framing techniques in our daily lives, especially when it comes to news and information. So what did the study find about how these two framing styles affected people's views on the Iraq War?
The research suggests that exposure to mythical framing, particularly in credible news sources like the New York Times, led to more favorable views of the president's handling of the war.
That's interesting and a bit concerning. It suggests that even seemingly objective news sources can use framing to shape public opinion, even on critical issues like war and peace.
It highlights the importance of being critical consumers of information, especially when it comes to complex and emotionally charged topics. We need to be aware of the potential for framing to influence our perceptions and to seek out diverse perspectives before forming our own opinions.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this framing stuff can be applied to some really big picture issues. But let's bring it back to something a little more personal. We've got another study here that examines how framing affects medical decision-making. I'm curious to see how this plays out in a healthcare setting.
This study is a fascinating one. It looks at how doctors present treatment options to patients and how the framing of those options can influence patient choices.
So like how a doctor might explain the risks and benefits of a particular surgery or medication.
Exactly. The study found that when doctors framed treatment options in terms of survival rates, for example, saying 90% of patients survive the surgery, patients were more likely to choose that option. However, when the same information was framed in terms of mortality rates, saying 10% of patients die during this surgery, patients were more likely to opt out of the procedure even though the statistical risk is the same.
It's amazing how much power a simple change in wording can have. It's like those two different frames are triggering completely different emotional responses, hope and optimism, versus fear and anxiety.
It underscores the profound influence framing can have on our decisions, even when it comes to matters of life and health. It also highlights the responsibility healthcare professionals have to present information in a balanced and unbiased way, allowing patients to make truly informed decisions.
This really makes me think about all the times I've been in a doctor's office and had to make a decision about treatment. I was starting to realize how easily my choices could have been swayed by the way the information was presented. It's a bit unsettling.
It's a reminder that we need to be active participants in our healthcare decisions, asking questions, seeking second opinions, and being aware of the potential for framing to influence our choices.
It's like we need to become framing detectives, constantly analyzing the information we're given and looking for those subtle cues that might be pushing us in one direction or another.
I like that analogy. Developing that critical lens is essential for navigating a world saturated with information and making choices that are truly aligned with our values and goals.
Well, deep divers, we've covered a lot of ground here. We've explored the different types of framing effects, looked at real-world research examples, and even delved into the ethical implications of framing in areas like healthcare and media coverage. But there's still so much to unpack. We'll be back in just a moment for the final part of our deep dive into the framing effect. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back, deep divers. We're in the final stretch of our exploration into the framing effect. And I'm ready to keep those aha moments coming.
Yeah, we still have some intriguing aspects to uncover from the research, especially about how we can use this knowledge to our advantage.
You know, as we've been talking about all these studies and examples,
Hmm.
I can't help but wonder, how much control do we really have over framing? Is it
Yeah.
all like subconscious manipulation,
Mhm.
or can we consciously use it
Right.
to make better decisions?
That's a fantastic question, and it's one that researchers have been grappling with for years.
Yeah.
The truth is, there's a delicate interplay between automatic and conscious processes when it comes to framing.
So on one hand, our brains are hardwired to respond to certain frames in predictable ways, like we
Mhm.
talked about with our aversion to loss.
Right.
But on the other hand, we can learn to recognize these patterns and make more deliberate choices.
Exactly. Think of it like this. We all have certain cognitive biases and tendencies that
Yeah.
make us susceptible to framing effects. But by becoming aware of these biases, we can start to develop strategies to mitigate their influence.
So it's like learning a new language.
Yeah.
Once you understand the grammar and vocabulary, you can start to
Deconstruct.
deconstruct, sentences and understand their underlying meaning.
Yeah.
In the case of framing, once you understand the different techniques
Yeah.
and how they work, you can start to see through the manipulation and make more objective decisions.
That's a great analogy. It's all about developing that critical lens
Yeah.
and learning to ask the right questions.
So what are those right questions?
For example, when you're presented with information, ask yourself, how is this being framed? What information is being emphasized or downplayed? Are there alternative ways to frame this issue?
It's like we need to become framing detectives, constantly analyzing the information we're given and looking for those subtle cues that might be influencing our perceptions.
Precisely. By developing this critical awareness, we can become more conscious consumers of information
Right.
and make choices that are aligned with our values and goals.
Okay, so we're not just helpless victims of framing. We have the power to take control. But what are some practical strategies we can use to become more, what did you say, conscious framers,
Conscious framers, yeah.
so to speak?
One powerful technique is to actively consider different perspectives.
Okay.
When faced with the decision, challenge yourself to reframe the situation from multiple angles. Imagine you're on a debate team, and you have to argue both for and against a particular proposition.
It's like playing devil's advocate with your own thoughts. That's a great way to,
Break free.
yeah, break free from those initial gut reactions
Yeah,
and force yourself to consider the issue more objectively.
exactly. Another strategy is to focus on the underlying facts and data. Rather than getting caught up in the emotional framing, look for evidence-based information and try to strip away the persuasive language and emotional appeals.
That makes sense. It's like separating the signal from the noise.
Yes.
It's easy to get swept away by a compelling story or a catchy slogan.
Yeah.
But we need to train ourselves to dig deeper and look for the substance beneath the surface.
And finally, don't underestimate the power of language.
Mm-hmm.
The words we choose, the way we structure our sentences, the examples we use, all of these contribute to the frame we create. By being mindful of our language, we can communicate more effectively and avoid unintentionally framing things in a misleading way.
This is all so empowering. It's like we're taking back control of our minds and our choices.
Yes.
Instead of being manipulated by framing, we can learn to use it to our advantage,
Exactly.
to make better decisions, and to communicate more effectively.
It's a journey of continuous learning and self-awareness. The more we understand about framing, the better equipped we'll be to navigate a world full of information and persuasion.
Well, deep divers, I think we've reached the bottom of our deep dive into the framing effect. We've explored the science, the psychology, and the real-world implications. But most importantly, we've learned that we're not powerless against this phenomenon. By understanding how framing works, we can become more conscious, critical thinkers and make choices that are truly aligned with our values.
I hope this deep dive has equipped you with the knowledge and tools to recognize framing effects and to make more informed decisions in all areas of your life. Remember, awareness is the first step. From there, you can start to develop those critical thinking skills and take control of your own cognitive destiny.
Before we officially surface, I want to leave you with one final thought to ponder. Now that you know about the framing effect, how will you approach information and decision-making differently? Will you be more skeptical of persuasive messages, more deliberate in your own choices? Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deeper. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious.